Caleb was a man who saw value where others saw only rust. As a veteran diesel mechanic running a struggling restoration shop on the gloomy coast of Oregon, his livelihood depended on salvaging parts from the dead to keep the living afloat. His latest venture took him to a grim government seizure auction, a place where the assets of bankrupt shipyards and seized smuggling vessels went to die. He wasn't looking for a fortune. He was looking for a specific cylinder head for a client's fishing trawler. However, fate had a different itinerary. Lot 404 was listed simply as Marine Propulsion Unit, non-functional, scrap weight. It was a monstrosity of iron and corrosion, sitting on a rotting wooden pallet, dripping fluids that had turned into black sludge decades ago. The auctioneer moved through the lot quickly, expecting no bids. The engine was massive, roughly the size of a small car, and encrusted with barnacles and layers of peeling green paint. It looked like it had spent time underwater. Most buyers ignored it, seeing only the logistical nightmare of moving such a heavy object. But Caleb, standing at the back with his arms crossed, noticed something the others missed. The shape of the intake manifold was wrong. It wasn't the standard cast-iron blocky shape of a 1940s diesel. It was swept back, aerodynamic, almost sculptural. On a hunch that the manifold alone might be worth salvaging for a custom build, he raised his paddle. He won the auction for the price of scrap metal, paying less than $500 for 3 tons of mystery machinery. Getting the beast back to his workshop was a monumental task involving a rented flatbed and a terrifying hour with his shop's overhead crane, which groaned under the unexpected density of the metal. Once the engine was finally resting on the concrete floor of his bay, the silence of the shop returned, leaving Caleb alone with his impulse buy. He grabbed a scraper, a wire brush, and a bucket of solvent, preparing for the dirty work of stripping it down. He expected to find cracked pistons and a seized crankshaft. He expected to harvest a few bolts and scrap the rest. He did not expect the engine to fight back. "Hey guys, quick break, because we need your help to validate this crazy engine discovery. We are so close to hitting 10,000 subscribers, and we need to smash that goal ASAP. If you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe. It makes a massive difference and helps us hunt down more mysteries. Also, drop a comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching this video from. We love seeing how far our adventures travel. Now, let's get back to the good stuff. The first anomaly appeared when Caleb tried to remove the valve cover. The bolts were not the standard hexagonal heads used in American maritime history. They were a strange, 12-point flange design that didn't fit any of his imperial sockets. Grumbling, he dug out his specialty metric tool set, rare for a vintage American engine context. The bolt turned, but it didn't feel like rusted steel grinding against steel. It turned smoothly, with a precision that defied the engine's outward appearance of decay. As he pulled the first bolt, he examined it under the shop light. It wasn't steel. It was lightweight, non-magnetic, and completely free of corrosion. It was high-grade titanium, a material that was astronomically expensive and virtually unheard of in standard tugboat manufacturing of that era. His curiosity piqued. Caleb attacked the layers of grime covering the engine block with renewed vigor. He applied the chemical stripper, watching the decades of green paint bubble and slide away. He was looking for a serial number, a manufacturer's stamp, anything to identify what he had actually bought. Usually, these engines were stamped by Detroit Diesel, heavy and crude. As the metal was exposed, Caleb stepped back, confused. The block wasn't cast iron. It was a smooth machine billet alloy. There were no rough casting marks. And there, etched into the side of the block where the paint had been thickest, was not a serial number, but a solitary, deeply engraved symbol, a stylized eagle gripping a lightning bolt, and a designation code that didn't exist in any civilian catalog. X77 prototype. Caleb realized he hadn't bought a tugboat engine. He had bought something that wasn't supposed to exist. The discovery of the X77 prototype stamp paralyzed Caleb. In the world of military surplus, prototype was a dangerous word. It meant experimental, it meant undocumented, and often it meant the government technically still owned it, regardless of what an auction receipt said. The initial thrill of finding something rare was quickly replaced by a wave of caution. He locked the doors of his workshop, pulling the heavy steel shutters down, shutting out the gray Oregon daylight. He felt an irrational sense of paranoia, as if the mere exposure of the eagle crest had triggered a silent alarm somewhere. He returned to the engine, circling it like a predator assessing a strange new beast. The external corrosion was clearly a disguise, a deliberate camouflage applied to make this piece of high-tech engineering look like common junk to the untrained eye. He decided to probe deeper into the machine's anatomy. The valve cover, held by the titanium bolts, was next. With meticulous care, he loosened the remaining fasteners, cataloging each one on his workbench. When he finally pried the cover loose, the seal broke with a sharp hiss of escaping pressure. The air inside had been trapped since the 1940s. He lifted the heavy alloy cover and gasped. The interior of the engine was not covered in black sludge or rust. It was pristine. The rocker arms and valve springs were bathed in a thick, translucent amber gel that smelled faintly of beeswax and ozone, a preservation agent he had never smelled in 30 years of mechanics. The metal components shone with a mirror polish, reflecting the overhead shop lights with dazzling clarity. This wasn't mass-production machining. This was the work of master craftsmen, hand-finished to microscopic tolerances. Caleb picked up a rag and wiped a small section of the camshaft. It revealed a strange, iridescent coating. He realized he was looking at an early form of friction-reducing ceramic plating, technology that wasn't supposed to exist in combustion engines until the late 1980s. The engine was a time capsule of impossible engineering. He left the physical work for a moment and went to his office, a cramped glass box overlooking the shop floor. He booted up his computer, his grease-stained fingers flying across the keyboard. He searched for U.S. Navy X-77, WW2 experimental marine propulsion, and Project Eagle Lightning. The standard internet searches yielded nothing but generic history pages about PT boats and destroyers. The X-77 didn't exist in the public record. He logged into a specialized, invite-only forum for military vehicle restorers, a digital watering hole for tank enthusiasts and warbird mechanics. He typed a vague description of the engine, omitting the specific code, asking about high-performance alloy marine prototypes from 1944. The response was slow, but one private message eventually popped up from a user known only as Old Salt. The message was cryptic. If you are looking at an engine with 12-point titanium bolts, stop posting. You have a ghost unit. These were built for the Office of Strategic Services for stealth insertion. All were ordered destroyed in 1946. If you have one, it's the only one left. The message chilled Caleb to the bone. The OSS was the precursor to the CIA. This engine was spycraft hardware. Driven by a mix of fear and insatiable curiosity, Caleb went back to the engine block. He needed to see the bottom end, the crankcase. If this was indeed a stealth engine, the crankshaft would be the key. He placed a drain pan under the massive oil sump and cracked the drain plug. The amber preservation gel oozed out slowly like cold honey. It took an hour to drain. Once empty, Caleb lay on his back on the creeper and slid underneath the suspended engine. He shone his flashlight up into the drain hole. The light caught something that wasn't part of the machinery. Resting on the bottom of the oil pan, stuck in the residual gel, was a metal cylinder about the size of a thermos made of dull brass. It was a watertight document tube, standard issue for naval vessels, but hiding inside the oil sump was a deliberate concealment tactic. Heart pounding, Caleb unbolted the entire oil pan. It was heavy, and as he lowered it, the brass tube clattered onto the concrete floor. He slid out from under the engine, wiped his hands, and picked up the cylinder. It was sealed with heavy wax and lead wire. This wasn't just an engine, it was a safe. The mechanic realized that whoever had preserved this engine with such care hadn't just been saving a piece of machinery. They were hiding what was inside this tube. He took the cylinder to his workbench, cleared away the tools, and picked up a pair of heavy shears to cut the lead wire. The seal cracked. He unscrewed the brass cap. Inside, rolled tightly, was a bundle of oil paper documents and a small, leather-bound notebook. Caleb carefully unrolled the brittle papers on his workbench, weighing down the curling corners with heavy spanners. The documents were blueprints, faded cyanotypes that smelled of old library archives and dust. The header on the first page confirmed the forum user's warning. Office of Strategic Services, Project Phantom Wake. The diagrams depicted a vessel unlike anything Caleb had ever seen. A low-profile, semi-submersible insertion craft designed to run acoustically silent for dropping agents behind enemy lines. The engine sitting in his shop was the beating heart of this ghost ship. The blueprints detailed the X-77 specifications, a naturally aspirated V-12 running on a hyper-refined aviation fuel mixture, capable of producing massive torque with near-zero vibration. The engineering was decades ahead of its time, utilizing the ceramic coatings and titanium alloys he had already discovered. But the blueprints were merely the technical context. The small leather notebook contained the human story. Caleb opened the journal with trembling hands. The pages were filled with the spidery, frantic handwriting of a man named Chief Engineer Silas Vance. The dates began in late 1944 and ended abruptly in August 1945. As Caleb read, the silence of the workshop seemed to press in closer. Vance described the pressure of the project, the sleepless nights, and the creeping suspicion that Project Phantom had been compromised from the inside. The final entries were erratic, written by a man who knew he was being watched. Vance believed that his superior officer, a man referred to only as Colonel H., planned to sell the technology to a foreign power as the war concluded, rather than turning it over to the U.S. government. The last entry in the journal was the most chilling. Vance described how he had sabotaged the paperwork, listing the engine as destroyed during testing, while physically smuggling the unit out of the research facility by mislabeling it as scrap ballast for a Navy tugboat. But Vance had done more than just hide the engine. He had used the engine itself as a vault. The journal referenced a secondary concealment within the mechanical governor assembly, a complex device used to regulate the engine's speed. Vance wrote, "If they find the engine, they will see a machine. Only the mechanic who dismantles the heart will find the soul. The schematics for the atomic pile triggers are safe within the weights." Caleb stopped reading. The room spun slightly. Atomic pile triggers. Vance wasn't just hiding an engine. He was hiding stolen designs for nuclear technology components, seemingly to keep them out of the colonel's corrupt hands. Caleb looked up from the book and stared at the front of the engine block. The mechanical governor was a bulbous, intricate housing mounted right at the front, driven by the camshaft gears. It was a mess of spinning weights and springs, designed to control fuel flow. To the untrained eye, it was just another heavy iron component. To Caleb, it was now the bullseye. He grabbed his tools and approached the governor assembly with the focus of a bomb disposal expert. If Vance had hidden documents or microfilm inside the spinning weights of a governor, the engineering required to balance it would have been insane. Caleb began to disassemble the outer casing. The screws here were sealed with red lead paint, untouched since 1945. As he removed the housing, the internal mechanism was revealed. Two massive brass flyweights meant to spin outward with centrifugal force. They looked solid, but the journal suggested otherwise. Caleb removed the assembly and placed it on the bench. He examined the flyweights closely. There was a hairline seam on the left weight, almost invisible to the naked eye. He clamped the brass weight in a vise, protecting it with soft jaws. There were no screws, no latches. It was likely a reverse-threaded friction fit, designed to tighten as the engine spun, sealing its secret forever unless someone knew exactly how to twist it. Caleb applied a strap wrench, straining against the cold metal. With a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot, the thread broke loose. He unscrewed the cap of the hollowed-out weight. Inside, packed tightly in cotton wool to prevent rattling and imbalance, was not paper, but a small, heavy, metallic canister made of lead, stamped with the radiation hazard symbol. A symbol that looked very different in 1945 than it did today, but was universally recognizable as a warning. Caleb stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't just dealing with a valuable prototype engine anymore. He was holding a lead-shielded container that, according to the journal, contained triggers. He didn't know if that meant blueprints for triggers or the physical components themselves. The workshop suddenly felt very small and very unsafe. He had just uncovered a piece of atomic history that had been missing for 80 years, and he had no idea if it was radioactive, unstable, or simply the most valuable thing he would ever touch. Caleb backed away from the workbench, his breathing shallow. The word radioactive was not something a diesel mechanic usually dealt with, unless it was the faint glow of radium dials on vintage aircraft dashboards. He needed to know if he had just contaminated his entire shop. He rushed to the back storage room, digging frantically through a plastic bin of old avionics testing equipment until his hand closed around a bulky, yellow Geiger counter he had bought at a swap meet years ago. He switched it on, the device letting out a low, static hum. Holding his breath, he approached the lead canister sitting on the vise. He extended the probe. The speaker clicked rhythmically, click, 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 but the tempo didn't increase. It was just background radiation. The lead shielding was either incredibly effective, or the contents were not radioactive material itself, but the machinery associated with it. Relief washed over him, followed immediately by a surge of adrenaline. If it wasn't a radioactive core, he could open it. He returned to the canister. The lead cap was soft. He used a plastic pry tool to work it loose without sparking. With a soft suction sound, the cap popped off. He tipped the canister over onto a clean white rag. Two objects slid out. The first was a roll of high-density microfilm, far wider than standard 35 millimeters, preserved in a glass vial. The second object was a physical device, no larger than a deck of cards, wrapped in oiled silk. Caleb unwrapped the silk. What lay in his palm was a piece of machining, so exquisite it looked like jewelry. It was a complex assembly of tungsten and gold, a series of interlocking gears and tumblers that moved with fluid, almost liquid precision. It wasn't a bomb part. It looked like a timing mechanism or a fail-safe key. He picked up his magnifying loupe and inspected the side of the device. There, microscopic laser etching, technology that was theoretically impossible in 1945, read, failsafe/sequence alpha/US Gov prop. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. This level of miniaturization belonged in the 21st century, yet it was pulled from an engine built before the transistor was invented. Silas Vance, the engineer, hadn't just been protecting a prototype. He had been protecting a technological leap that defied history. Caleb turned his attention to the microfilm. He didn't have a proper projector, so he improvised. He rigged a high-lumen tactical flashlight behind the glass vial and used his loupe to project the image onto a sheet of white paper taped to the wall. The image was blurry but legible. He adjusted the focus. The blueprints displayed on the wall were for a device called the dampener. As Caleb deciphered the technical annotations, the true nature of the discovery became clear. It wasn't a weapon trigger. It was a remote kill switch for early atomic detonation mechanisms. The U.S. government had secretly developed a way to neutralize their own weapons, or the enemy's, using a specific frequency resonance, and this tungsten device was the master key. This technology, if it had been known, would have changed the entire Cold War. Suddenly, the lights in the workshop flickered. Caleb's head snapped toward the office. His computer monitor, which he had left on the military forum page, had gone black. A moment later, it rebooted, but not to the desktop. It sat on a BIOS screen, frozen. The internet connection light on his modem was blinking rapidly, erratic orange flashes indicating a massive data transfer. Someone was scrubbing his digital footprint. The warning from Old Salt hadn't been a friendly tip, it was a final notice. Caleb rushed to the front of the shop, peering through the slats of the heavy steel shutters. The street outside was dark, slick with Oregon rain. But parked half a block down, idling with its lights off, was a black SUV. It wasn't a local car. The windows were heavily tinted, and it bore no dealership markings. They had found him. The search queries for X-77 and Project Phantom had tripped a silent alarm in some forgotten, automated database that was still listening after 80 years. He realized with terrifying clarity that he couldn't stay there. The shop was a trap. He had to move the evidence. He couldn't take the massive engine, but he could take the soul. He grabbed the tungsten key, the microfilm, and Vance's leather journal, shoving them into a waterproof Pelican case he used for boat diagnostics. He hesitated, looking at the massive X-77 engine. He couldn't leave it to be found so easily. He grabbed a heavy tarp and threw it over the engine, then piled old truck tires and rusty exhaust pipes around it, effectively burying the prototype under a mountain of generic scrap. It wouldn't fool a thorough search, but it might buy him time. He ran to the back door of the shop, which opened into a narrow, mud-slicked alleyway. His rusted pickup truck was parked there. He tossed the Pelican case onto the passenger seat and froze. The sound of a car door closing echoed from the front street. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, were crunching on the gravel of his front lot. They weren't waiting anymore. Caleb jumped into his truck, turning the key. The old diesel roared to life, loud and unmistakable in the quiet night. He slammed the truck into gear and peeled out of the alleyway just as the front door of his shop was kicked in with a thunderous crash. The mechanic was no longer just a salvager. He was a fugitive carrying the most dangerous secret of the 20th century. The rain was coming down in sheets, transforming the coastal highway into a slick, treacherous ribbon of black asphalt. Caleb pushed his old diesel truck to its limit, the engine roaring in protest as the speedometer needle wavered past 80. In the rearview mirror, the blinding white LEDs of the black SUV cut through the storm, steady and unrelenting. They were gaining. Caleb knew his truck had the torque to pull a house, but it had the aerodynamics of a brick. He couldn't win a drag race against modern government hardware. He needed to change the game. He needed to take them where horsepower didn't matter, and suspension travel did. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, and scanned the dark tree line for the marker he knew from his childhood, a rusted yellow gate marking the entrance to the old Henderson logging road. It was a decommissioned track, a nightmare of deep ruts, washout mud pits, and fallen timber. It was suicide for a city vehicle, but home turf for his lifted work truck. He slammed the brakes, the heavy tires locking up momentarily on the wet pavement, and yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck fishtailed, spraying gravel, and smashed through the rusted chain of the gate. He shifted into 4-low, the transmission clunking reassuringly, and gunned it into the dark tunnel of Douglas firs. The SUV didn't hesitate. It swerved after him, its sophisticated traction control system struggling to find purchase on the clay-slicked mud. Caleb watched in the mirror as the pursuers bounced violently, their low ground clearance causing sparks to fly as the undercarriage scraped against hidden rocks. The chase slowed to a crawl, a brutal contest of mechanical endurance. Caleb navigated the terrain by memory, dodging wheel-swallowing potholes that he knew would cripple the SUV's independent suspension. After a mile of bone-jarring climbing, he reached a fork in the trail. He killed his headlights, plunging the truck into total darkness, and steered silently into a dense thicket of overgrown brush, holding his breath. Moments later, the SUV roared past the hiding spot, its searchlight sweeping the trees, the engine whining high and angry. They took the left fork, deeper into the dead-end wilderness. Caleb waited until the taillights vanished around a bend before exhaling. He was safe for now, but he was trapped in the woods with a box of secrets that people were willing to kill for. He needed to regroup. He turned on the dome light, the weak yellow bulb illuminating the cab. He opened the Pelican case again, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline dump. He ignored the tungsten device and focused on Vance's journal. If the engineer had predicted this betrayal in 1945, he must have had an escape plan. Caleb flipped to the back of the notebook. The pages were blank, but the paper felt different, thicker. He held the page up to the dome light. Nothing. He remembered the preservation techniques of the engine, wax and lead. He took a lighter from his pocket and ran the flame quickly underneath the blank page, careful not to burn it. The heat reacted with invisible sympathetic ink, likely lemon juice or a chemical compound common in spycraft. Brown letters began to ghost onto the page. It was a set of coordinates, not for a location in Europe, but right here in the Pacific Northwest. The text below the numbers read, Station 4, the listening post. If the eagle falls, bring the heart here. Caleb realized with a start that the Project Phantom testing hadn't just been in a lab. They had tested the stealth boat in the deep, cold fjords of the Oregon coast, hiding in plain sight among the fishing fleets. Station 4 must have been their forward operating base, long forgotten by the Navy, erased from the maps, but perhaps still standing. He checked the coordinates on his offline GPS unit. The location was 40 miles north, situated on a desolate stretch of cliffs known as Smuggler's Cove, a place locals avoided due to treacherous currents and rock slides. It was the perfect place to hide a ghost. Caleb put the truck in gear. He couldn't go back to civilization. His credit cards would be tracked, his face was likely on a watch list, and his shop was a crime scene. His only way out was to follow the instructions of a dead man from 1945. He guided the truck back onto the main logging trail, keeping his lights off, navigating by the faint moonlight filtering through the storm clouds, driving toward the coast where the final secret of the X-77 awaited. The Oregon coastline was a jagged blade of black basalt cutting into the churning Pacific. Smuggler's Cove lived up to its name. It was a depression in the cliffs, invisible from the highway, and shielded from the sea by a towering rock formation known as the Devil's Thumb. Caleb abandoned his truck a mile out, concealing it beneath a canopy of dense spruce boughs and covering the windshield with mud to dull any reflection. He proceeded on foot, the Pelican case heavy in his hand, moving through the stinging rain like a ghost. The coordinates from Vance's journal led him not to a building, but to what appeared to be a collapsed section of the cliff face, a graveyard of scree and boulders. To the casual observer, it was just erosion. To Caleb, who knew what to look for, the landslide looked too uniform, too deliberate. He climbed over the wet rocks, slipping on patches of moss, until he found the anomaly, a rusted iron ventilation hood protruding from the earth at an odd angle, disguised as a piece of driftwood. Below it, buried under decades of soil buildup, was the seam of a concrete lintel. He spent 30 minutes digging with a folding entrenching tool until he exposed a heavy steel door, riveted and sealed with a rotary handle that had rusted into a solid block of iron. It was marked with the faint, stenciled letters, USN Station 4 restricted. Brute force wouldn't work here. Caleb took a can of penetrating oil from his pack and soaked the hinges, then used a portable blowtorch to heat the metal until it glowed cherry red. With a grunt of exertion and the leverage of a pry bar, the seal cracked. The door groaned, a sound like a dying beast, and swung inward, releasing a puff of stale, dead air that hadn't moved since 1945. Caleb stepped into the darkness, his tactical flashlight cutting a beam through the floating dust motes. He was in a long, descending concrete corridor, lined with rotting wooden cable runs. The walls were weeping with moisture, but the structure was sound. As he descended deeper into the cliff, the sound of the storm outside faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. He emerged into a cavernous main chamber that took his breath away. It wasn't just a bunker, it was a subterranean dry dock. A massive pool of black, stagnant water dominated the center of the room, connected to the ocean by an underwater tunnel. The dock was empty, save for rotting support chocks where a vessel had once rested. The phantom wake was gone, but the facility that built her remained frozen in time. To his left was the command center, a glass-walled observation deck overlooking the dock. Caleb climbed the steel stairs, the grating ringing under his boots. Inside the control room, the scene was eerie. Coffee cups still sat on desks next to overflowing ashtrays, and clipboards hung on the walls. It looked as if the crew had simply vanished mid-shift. But the equipment was the real shock. Banks of vacuum tube computers, oscilloscopes, and radar screens lined the walls, but they were modified with the same strange, futuristic aesthetic as the engine. The dials were marked with impossible metrics: resonance frequency, atomic decay rate, and target nullification. This was the nerve center for the dampener technology. In the center of the room stood a solitary, heavy metal console, bolted to the floor. It didn't look like the other electronics. It was mechanical, a masterpiece of analog encryption. On its face was a complex array of tumblers and a distinct, oddly shaped keyway. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He opened the Pelican case and took out the tungsten device, the key he had extracted from the engine's governor. It was the missing piece. The key wasn't for the engine was just the courier. The key was for this console. He inserted the tungsten device into the slot. It slid in with a satisfying, airtight click. He turned it. The mechanism inside the console whirred, a sound of clockwork gears engaging after 80 years of slumber. A heavy drawer popped open with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, there were no gold bars, no cash. There was only a single, thick binder bound in lead-lined leather and a reel-to-reel tape. Caleb opened the binder. The first page was a list of names under the heading Project Eagle, Liquidation Protocol. As he scanned the list, the blood drained from his face. The names weren't just soldiers, they were politicians, industrialists, and high-ranking officials. The document detailed a coup. The dampener technology hadn't been lost, it had been sold. The people listed had formed a private consortium to hoard the tech, using it to manipulate the post-war energy market and suppress nuclear competition. They had murdered the original engineering team to keep the secret. Vance had been the only one to escape, hiding the key in the one place he knew they wouldn't look, inside the very engine they viewed as scrap. Caleb realized the gravity of his situation. The black SUV chasing him wasn't the government. It was the private security arm of this 60-year-old consortium, a corporate entity that had grown from these stolen secrets. They didn't want the engine for a museum. They wanted to destroy the only evidence that proved their empire was built on treason. Suddenly, a vibration shook the dust from the ceiling. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the rhythmic, thumping beat of rotor blades. The sound grew louder, reverberating through the ventilation shafts. A bright searchlight swept past the external vents, flashing briefly across the dark water of the dry dock below. They hadn't just tracked his truck, they had tracked the thermal signature of the heat he used to open the door. They were here. Caleb was trapped underground in a dead-end bunker with the proof of a century-long conspiracy, and the enemy was knocking at the front door. The vibration from the helicopter rotors overhead became a physical assault, shaking dust from the concrete ceiling of the command center. Caleb knew the layout of the bunker from the blueprints, and he knew that the main ventilation shaft, the source of the fresh air, was also the most obvious insertion point for a fast-rope team. He had minutes, perhaps seconds, before a highly trained paramilitary squad dropped into the corridor behind him. He wasn't a soldier, he was a mechanic. He couldn't fight them, but he understood machines, and he was standing inside one of the largest, most complex machines ever built by the U.S. Navy. The bunker itself was a weapon. He frantically scanned the command console, looking for a defensive option. There were switches for ventilation purge and core dump, but his eyes locked onto a heavy red-painted lever shielded by a glass casing. Dry dock flush, emergency only. The schematics he had memorized earlier explained its function. It was designed to rapidly flood the chamber to extinguish a catastrophic fire on a vessel, utilizing the immense pressure of the Pacific Ocean waiting just outside the sea gates. It wasn't an escape hatch, it was a deluge protocol, but it was his only chance to change the battlefield. A deafening boom echoed from the tunnel entrance. They had breached the blast door. The sound of heavy boots sprinting on metal grating followed immediately. Caleb smashed the glass casing with the butt of his heavy flashlight and seized the red lever. He yanked it down with both hands. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the floor beneath him shuddered. Deep within the rock, massive hydraulic pumps groaned to life, fighting 80 years of dormancy. The sound was like a dying wail, a low-frequency moan that vibrated in his chest. At the far end of the dry dock, the massive steel sea gates began to crack open. A wall of white water, pressurized by the crushing weight of the ocean, exploded into the stagnant pool. The sudden influx of water created a violent, churning maelstrom, turning the silent black pond into a raging cauldron. The noise was deafening, drowning out the sound of the approaching footsteps. Caleb grabbed the pelican case, ensuring the latches were double-locked. He had the evidence, the binder, the tape, and the tungsten key. He climbed over the railing of the control tower, looking down at the rising water. It was suicide to jump into that chaotic current, but it was execution to stay in the room. The door to the command center flew open. 3 figures clad in black tactical gear and night vision goggles burst in, their rifles raised. They were professional, silent, and lethal. They spotted Caleb instantly. A suppressor-dampened shot pinged off the steel railing inches from his hand. Caleb didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the rail, plummeting 30 feet into the churning, freezing black water below. The thermal shock hit him like a sledgehammer, forcing the air from his lungs. The cold was paralyzing, sharper and deeper than anything he had felt in the bay. He kicked frantically, clinging to the buoyant pelican case like a life raft. The current generated by the incoming tide and the active pumps was chaotic, slamming him against floating debris and rotting timber supports. Above him, he saw the beams of tactical lights sweeping the surface of the water, searching for a target. Bullets struck the water around him, cutting white streaks through the darkness, losing their lethality as they slowed in the dense liquid. Caleb realized the water level was rising rapidly, lifting him toward the ceiling of the cavern. If he stayed here, he would be trapped against the rock and drowned, or captured when the room filled. He needed to get out of the gate, against the incoming flow. But the physics were wrong, the water was rushing in. Then he remembered the secondary function of the flush system from the manual: cyclical exchange. The system didn't just fill, it circulated. Deep underwater, giant intake turbines were pulling water out to regulate the level. It was a terrifying gamble. If he let himself be sucked down, he might be ground into paste by an impeller, or he might be ejected through the outflow bypass. He took a massive breath, filling his burning lungs, and dove. He dragged the heavy case down with him, fighting the buoyancy. The darkness was absolute. He felt the pull of the water change direction, grabbing his legs and dragging him toward the bottom of the bay. He surrendered to the current, tucking his body into a ball to protect his head. He was tumbled violently, spinning in the pitch black, scraping against concrete walls covered in razor-sharp barnacles. His lungs screamed for oxygen. The pressure built in his ears. Just as his vision began to spot with gray stars, he felt a sudden acceleration, a whoosh of speed, and then, nothing. He was ejected into the open ocean. The pressure released. He kicked upward, desperate for the surface. He broke the water, gasping, coughing up salt water, the pelican case bobbing beside him. He was outside. The storm was still raging, rain lashing his face, and huge swells lifted and dropped him. He looked back at the cliff face. The Smuggler's Cove rock formation loomed above, and he could see the faint flicker of flashlights high up in the hidden vents. They were still inside, searching for a body. They didn't know he had been flushed out like industrial waste. He was alive, but he was floating a mile offshore in freezing water, in a storm, with the most dangerous secret in the world tied to his wrist. The Pacific Ocean was a merciless expanse of freezing black swells, tossing Caleb like a piece of driftwood. For an hour, he fought to keep his head above the crests, his grip on the Pelican case the only thing keeping him buoyant. The hypothermia was creeping in, a seductive numbness that made his limbs feel heavy and distant. Just as his strength began to fail, a massive wave surged him forward, slamming him onto a bed of sharp, barnacle-encrusted rocks. He clawed his way up the jagged shoreline, coughing up salt water, dragging the heavy case behind him until he reached the safety of the damp, mossy tree line. He collapsed in the underbrush, shivering violently, his body racked with spasms as he fought to regulate his temperature. He had washed ashore a few miles south of Smuggler's Cove, near a cluster of high-end, seasonal vacation rentals that stood dark and empty in the off-season. Driven by the primal need for warmth, Caleb staggered toward the nearest house, a modern glass and cedar structure overlooking the cliffs. He used his pocket multi-tool to silently shim the lock on the back door. The interior was warm, smelling of pine and expensive furniture. He stripped off his soaked coveralls, finding dry clothes in a closet, a cashmere sweater and heavy denim jeans that were a size too big but dry. He raided the pantry for high-calorie energy bars, and huddled in front of a gas fireplace he managed to ignite, slowly bringing his core temperature back from the brink. Once the shivering subsided, Caleb turned his attention back to the Pelican case. He needed to understand exactly what he was dying for. He opened the lead-line binder again, bypassing the 1945 names and flipping to the very end. Tucked into the back pocket was a recent addendum, dated only 2 weeks ago. It was a corporate memo from a company called Aerotech Dynamics, a massive defense contractor known for cutting-edge drone technology. The memo detailed the upcoming launch of a revolutionary, silent-drive propulsion system for the next generation of nuclear submarines. The technical specs attached to the memo were identical to the cyanotypes of the X-77 engine. The realization hit Caleb with the force of a physical blow. The consortium wasn't just a group of old men protecting a WW2 secret. It was a modern, multi-billion-dollar corporation about to defraud the U.S. government and the world with stolen, 80-year-old technology. They had murdered the original inventors, hidden the evidence, and were now repackaging it as their own invention. The prototype, Engine in the Woods, was the physical proof of prior art. If Caleb produced the engine and the documents, Aerotech's patent would be void, their stock would crash, and their executives would go to prison for treason and fraud. He wasn't just holding a history lesson, he was holding a corporate death sentence worth billions. He needed a secure line. He found a laptop in the home office and booted it up, using a guest Wi-Fi network to mask his location. He didn't go to the police. Aerotech undoubtedly had the local authorities on payroll. He didn't go to the FBI website. That was too slow. He went back to the source. He logged into the Military Restoration Forum and sent a direct message to Old Salt. I have the heart of the eagle. I have the liquidation list. And I know about Aerotech. I need a federal extraction. Now. The reply came within 30 seconds. I hoped you were dead, for your sake. I am Admiral Thomas Halloway, retired, U.S. Naval Intelligence. If you have what you say you have, you are the most dangerous man in America right now. Aerotech has a kill team authorized. You cannot go to a police station. They will intercept you. You need to get to federal territory where their private security has no jurisdiction. A map pin dropped on the screen. It was the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, specifically the Public Museum Annex, a location swarming with active-duty shore patrol and tourists. It was public, it was federal, and it was heavily guarded. Bring the package to the main gate at 0900 hours tomorrow. I will have a provost marshal team waiting. Do not stop. Do not trust anyone. Caleb checked the time. He had 6 hours to cover 200 miles. He needed a vehicle. He looked at the keys hanging by the front door of the rental. A Range Rover sat in the driveway. It was conspicuous but fast. He grabbed the keys and the Pelican case. He was done running through the woods. He was a mechanic, and he was going to drive. He slipped into the driver's seat, the leather creaking. As he backed out of the driveway, he saw headlights cresting the hill in the distance. The black SUV from the shop. They were grid-searching the coast, tracking the debris from the bunker flush. They spotted him instantly. The chase was back on, but this time Caleb wasn't heading into the mud. He punched the accelerator, the supercharged engine roaring. He was taking the fight to the highway, heading straight for the naval base. He had to keep the evidence safe for one final run, but he knew that simply delivering the papers wouldn't be enough. He needed the engine, and he had a plan to make sure the X-77 made its final journey, even if he didn't. The speedometer of the stolen Range Rover buried itself past 120 miles per hour. The highway to the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard was a blur of gray asphalt and panicked traffic as Caleb wove through the morning commuters. In his rearview mirror, the black SUV was relentless, its grille looming like the mouth of a shark. The mercenaries weren't trying to be subtle anymore. They were trying to run him off the road before he reached federal jurisdiction. They bumped his rear bumper, sending the heavy SUV into a terrifying fishtail that Caleb barely corrected with a white-knuckled grip on the wheel. Ahead, the massive concrete barriers and checkpoint lights of the naval base main gate came into view, a fortress of safety if he could reach it. He didn't slow down. He couldn't. If he stopped at the visitor line, the mercenaries would box him in and kill him right there in the queue. He flashed his high beams and leaned on the horn, aiming for the barricade gap used by rapid response vehicles. The base alarms began to blare. Military police scrambled, rifles raised, seeing a civilian vehicle charging the gate at high speed. The black SUV, realizing Caleb's suicidal plan, surged forward for one final ramming attempt, smashing into the side of the Rover just as they crossed the perimeter line. Metal screamed as the two vehicles locked together, spinning out of control and crashing through the heavy chain-link fence, coming to a halt in a cloud of steam and shattered glass on the pristine grass of the Admiral's lawn. Silence hung for a heartbeat, broken only by the sound of 40 rifles cocking in unison. Caleb kicked his door open, stumbling out with his hands raised, the Pelican case handcuffed to his wrist. "Federal witness. I have the package. Call Admiral Holloway," he screamed, his voice cracking with exhaustion. The mercenaries in the black SUV attempted to reverse, but a heavily armored Bearcat tactical vehicle slammed into their path, boxing them in. They were trapped on federal soil. A silver staff car pulled up to the chaotic scene. An older man in a pristine dress uniform stepped out, Admiral Old Salt Holloway. He looked at the wreckage, then at Caleb. "Secure that man," Holloway ordered, pointing to Caleb. "And arrest those men," he gestured to the mercenaries, "for attempted assassination of a federal asset and trespassing on a nuclear facility." The Pelican case was unlocked right there on the hood of the staff car. Holloway reviewed the lead-line binder, the tungsten key, and the Aerotech memo. He looked up, a grim smile crossing his face. "You did it, son. You just sank $1 billion pirate ship." The fallout was swift and brutal. With the physical evidence secured and the X-77 engine recovered from Caleb's hiding spot in the woods, the Department of Justice launched a massive raid on Aerotech Dynamics. The revolutionary submarine drive they were selling was proven to be stolen U.S. Navy property from 1945. The corporate executives who had authorized the hit on Caleb were indicted on charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. The stock of Aerotech plummeted to zero overnight, saving the U.S. taxpayers billions in fraudulent contracts. 3 months later, Caleb stood in a quiet, climate-controlled hall within the National Museum of the U.S. Navy. In the center of the room, bathed in respectful spotlight, sat the X-77 prototype. It had been fully restored, not by Navy technicians, but by Caleb himself, who was hired as the lead consultant for the exhibit. The engine gleamed, its titanium bolts and ceramic coatings finally appreciated for the engineering marvels they were. It was no longer a piece of scrap. It was the ghost heart, the machine that ended a war and a corporate empire. Caleb wasn't wearing greasy coveralls anymore. He wore a sharp suit. The government reward for recovering the lost technology, combined with the whistleblower payout for exposing the Aerotech fraud, had been substantial. The final settlement check handed to the mechanic from Oregon was for $12.5 million, a finder's fee calculated based on the saved defense budget. He walked out of the museum and into the bright sunlight of the harbor. He had bought a new shop, a massive facility fully equipped to restore vintage machinery, but this time he didn't have to scrape for parts. He unlocked the door of his own vintage restoration, a pristine 1960s muscle car, and looked back at the museum one last time. He had gone to an auction looking for a cylinder head and found a legacy. He turned the key, the engine roared to life, and Caleb drove away, a millionaire mechanic who knew that sometimes the rust is just a wrapper for the gold underneath. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this incredible story of history, danger, and redemption, please destroy that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing true stories of treasure and mystery. See you in the next video.